This is the legend of a woman named Janina. Born in Montreal, Canada, Janina grew up with an early exposure to music. Beginning her piano lessons with her mom at 4 years old, she would exponentially improve herself pianistically in her early years. By the age of 12, Janina would make her solo piano performing debut with the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. At this point, it became clear that Janina was a force to be reckoned with on the concert stage. Janina was happy. And then one day, something virtuosic would happen. Something that would change her life forever. At 18 years old, Janina would win first prize at the 1969 CBC National Radio Competition for Young Performers. The next year, in 1970, Janina was accepted into Juilliard and would study piano under the great Sascha Gorodnitzki. 4 years later, in 1974, Janina would win third prize at the very first edition of the Arthur Rubinstein International Piano Competition. Janina's performance was so impactful that the great Arthur Rubinstein himself became Janina's mentor. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Arthur Rubinstein, he is considered one of the greatest pianists of all time, and also one of the greatest interpreters of Fryderyk Chopin's music of his time. Well, Rubinstein himself would describe Janina as a born Chopin interpreter. For the next 50 years and counting, Janina would perform at the world's most renowned concert halls. She also premiered Franz Liszt's rediscovered Piano Concerto No. 3 with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Janina was appointed Officer of the Order of Canada and the Governor General's 2012 Lifetime Achievement Award in Classical Music, Canada's equivalent to the U.S. Kennedy Center Awards, as well as 3 honorary doctorates. In 2018, Janina won a Juno Award for Classical Album of the Year. Janina is also involved with examining the next generation of virtuoso pianists, having served as the chair of the 2023 edition of the Cliburn International Junior Piano Competition, also known as the U.S. Open of Piano Competitions. Janina's career still continues to shine. From awards with the British Broadcasting Corporation to masterful performances, Janina has forged a path of her own, and her path has become a legend. This is the legend of Janina Fialkowska. Janina, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a great pleasure.
So let's start off from the very, very beginning.
Right.
Your mom was your first piano teacher. And what was it like to study with her? And how has that inspired you in a very early sense in your piano career?
Well, the thing is that it all turned out very well. And so I'm eternally grateful to my mother because she was a very strict teacher, and she had studied herself with a pupil of Concerto in Paris right before World War II, and she was a good pianist, but she was not a great pianist, and she really didn't have time to develop because the war came. But she got me going, made me practice very hard, and as I say, I'm eternally grateful because without that early discipline, and discipline, I would say, was the main thing that I learned from my mother. I would never have got this far. So I'm grateful.
Yeah.
I won't say if it hadn't worked out. But it did work out.
Yeah. And actually, my mom was also my first piano teacher too back in the day. Mm-hmm. So I very much relate to that discipline and that structure that was required to be able to learn effectively the foundations of pianistic performance early on. And then after studying with your mom, you would then study with Yvonne Hubert. What was it like to study with her?
No, she was a marvelous teacher. She was an extraordinary teacher if you look at the list of her pupils. I mean, practically everybody of my generation in Canada who made an international career has studied with her. she was a perfectionist. She played beautifully herself, but never really demonstrated. She was always sitting next to me and demonstrating with her left hand, and she had the most extraordinary left hand. There were lots of things about her. She was extraordinarily musical. She taught me about phrasing. She taught me, again, it was a great lesson in discipline as well, of hard practicing and never letting anything go by that was slightly off center. I mean, she was a very direct and very good teacher.
And I can tell that this was also the beginnings of being very detail oriented too in your performance.
Well, I think so. And I think also we have to remember that my mother came from the French school, from the Cortot school. Mademoiselle Hubert was a pupil of Cortot. So I'm very much in this Cortot mode. And this also means that very important solfège and dictation, things like that, but also the kind of repertoire I played. A lot of Bach, a lot of French music, less Brahms. As a matter of fact, I never played any Brahms with them. And, and Chopin. I started Chopin when I was about 12.
Wow, around 12. That's quite fascinating. That's actually quite, I mean, in my experience, I started Chopin maybe around when I was 7 or 8 at that point. Maybe it's just kind of like the different kind of repertoire that I was exposed to at the time. But that's truly fascinating. When you mentioned that there was not really much emphasis, or really any emphasis on Brahms at the time.
No.
But Bach, absolutely. I think if I remember, even in different, not just even in classical music, but even in the jazz tradition with Oscar Peterson, I believe he went on record saying that he actually teaches his students Bach because the fundamentals of the melisma and also with the harmonic structure and being able to work with counter melodies in such a proper way is so transferable. It's a transferable skill, really, in really any kind of musical performance. And that's, I believe, what Oscar Peterson said back in the day.
I think so. And also, I learned to do, I would take a four-voice fugue of Bach. And what I was meant to do then was play on the piano three of the voices and sing the fourth. And then, this is very difficult stuff. And I was pretty young at the time, but this is a way of really learning your music. And the thing with Bach, of course, that everybody's afraid of is forgetting because it's so complicated. But if you do it that way, of course, chances are minimal.
Yeah. So it's safe to say that you already had bel canto singing very early on by going through Bach already at that point, eh?
You're right.
Yeah.
Because I did go to Paris and I did study with yet another pupil of Cortot, which was Yvonne Lefebure, one of the most flamboyant teachers on the face of the earth. And she was sort of a continuation of Yvonne Hubert, but much more theatrical, much more, what I learned from her was much more how to play for the public. And that's basically what I came away from Yvonne Lefebure.
That's fascinating.
And then I went to Juilliard.
That is so fascinating because that theatrical part is something, and even going back to Jane's episode, when she was looking at this Canadian Chopin competition, for example, she noted that, the theatrical part is sort of nice, but in her opinion, it was also like, it didn't want to distract from the performance, right? So it's so fascinating to know that there's also this balance between just not too much theatrics, but not too little, but just try and find that proper fine-tuned area where you're not trying to distract from the main thing, which is the actual music itself.
Exactly. In fact, when I say theatrical, I mean that they would look for what was theatrical in the music, and the fact of that you are a performer, and that you can't just play for yourself. So it has to somehow come out. And so that was mainly what I didn't. Madame Lefebure was one of the most serious musicians I ever met. And she would never do anything that was just pour épater les gens, to make people scream and jump up and down and bravo. She was an ultimate musician. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And now that we get to Juilliard, what was the
Yes.
application process like back in those days? And from what, to the best of your ability, to what extent is that application process from your time similar or different to the application process nowadays?
Right. Well, what I did was that I came back from Paris. My mother, again, having a great influence over my career still. I was pretty young still. And she thought I'd had enough of studying with Madame Lefebure, and she wanted me back home. And Canada Council was extremely generous, but I went for a year and studied privately with Mr. Gorodnitzki before entering Juilliard. So he was there on the entrance jury panel, and it was just a shoe in that I would get in because he wanted me as his student. I don't really remember. I just remember filling out some forms there and playing for this panel and being absolutely sure that I was going to get in anyway. So it was very easy for me. To be completely honest, I don't know what they do nowadays. I have no idea.
Right.
So I don't know if it's more difficult, if it's a different. I think in my day at Juilliard, we're talking, when did I go? In 71. I was actually at the school, 71 to about 75. And it was very much enabling people like myself to enter competitions and to do concerts and kind of cut classes. There was very little sort of interest in the theoretical part of music at that time, which was great for the ones like myself who were about to make big careers. You know, that we weren't tied down to the school. However, I know that after I left, now we're talking a long time ago, everything changed, and that it became much more a real kind of university curriculum, and kids really had to study history and I don't know what and stuff, and really be there at the classes. How it is now, I don't know. I have to say, I know that there's some very fine teachers again there, and very fine pianists coming out of Juilliard. So that's good. But I don't know what the entrance procedure is.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear that. I mean, back then already, and even till this day now, there's still a very strong pedigree of pianism and really musicianship, really at Juilliard. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you mentioned about Sascha Gorodnitzki
Mm-hmm.
because during this time, as you mentioned, actually even before you went to Juilliard, he was already your teacher by that point.
Yeah.
What were the most important lessons that you learned from him, and what surprised you about his playing style?
Very interesting and a good question. Mr. Gornitsky was a pupil of Joseph Levine and a lifelong devotee of the pianism of Rachmaninoff. In fact, he knew Rachmaninoff and played for him all. Um, in the true Russian style, Mr. Gornitsky had the most beautiful sound when he played. Just it was a velvet sound. It was absolutely gorgeous. And this is probably what he most passed on to me. Mr. Gornitsky had a complete contempt for French musicians. Absolute. He had a horror for them. I think he once heard Cortot in New York and decided he hated it, and that was it. So, I mean, in the very first lesson I ever had with him, he's just stated, Janina, dear, we got to get rid of all those French habits. Well, okay, he didn't because I liked my French habits. Not all of them, maybe, but in the end, I'm not very, combative. I never fight. So, but I'm silently stubborn. So we did end up adoring each other and compromising. And he never tried to change the way I held my hands because there is a real Gorodnitsky technique that is known and that most of his students learned. No, he left my fingers the way I had. You know, he showed me different sounds, these beautiful sounds that I did not have. And I remember the very first lessons I had with him, I would be flying down from Montreal to play every 2 weeks for 2 hours. And for the first 5 lessons, we just stayed on the first movement of the Chopin B flat minor sonata. I mean, he was that obsessed with perfection and beauty of sound and phrasing. And it was very interesting because he would demonstrate. He would sit at the second piano and he would demonstrate. It was always very, very lovely, but it was rather impersonal what he did. And I think that's the mark of a truly great teacher, and that he didn't try and impose his individuality or his personality on any of his students. So, in fact, we all sounded different. We all, in the end, had his beautiful sound, but we played very differently. I'll say that, at my time, Garrick Olson was a pupil of his, and there were lots of that caliber. And we were, as I say, we were all different. And that's, I think, the mark of a truly great teacher.
It certainly is. And when you mentioned the Gorodnitzki technique, this may be a bit difficult for our listeners who are only listening to the audio-only version of this podcast, but could you describe or show what is the Gorodnitzki technique, just in terms of like the hand, the fingering, or that sort of thing? How does that exactly work, and how does that contrast from your own technique?
Well, and I use his technique when I want to make a beautiful phrase of a certain kind of rich romantic sound. And of course, you use the flat of your fingers, the fat part of the tip of your finger, and you use the wrist and the arm as well. And it all envelops into this beautiful, rich sound. Now, beforehand, when I studied in Paris, for example, it was very much more this kind of technique, je parlais, which is the French word for example, when you're playing Mozart. I wouldn't want to completely use the Gorodnitzki sound for Mozart, but I would love to use that very clear and crystalline French sound that Madame Lefebure taught me. The same thing was that Mr. Gorodnitzki, it wasn't particularly good for Debussy or Ravel or any of the French composers, but as I say, absolutely fantastic for Chopin, Schumann, and the Russians, of course.
Yeah, and that's truly an interesting technique, and I think it's also a pretty important difference and nuance that for experienced pianists to hear. It's something that you can just ever so slightly change that can really differentiate your performance of various composers from different eras of specific pieces, especially as you mentioned, like Chopin or Mozart, depending on what technique that you're picking between. What were the greatest challenges that you faced during your time at Juilliard? Because aside from all these lessons and your time there, what were those challenges that you had to face, and how did you overcome these challenges?
Well, when I first arrived, I was unbelievably shy, unbelievably scared of being alone in New York, unbelievably homesick. But very, very, very quickly, I used to practice on the Juilliard fifth floor. And on the Juilliard fifth floor, there were only about 6 or 7 practice rooms. On the fourth floor, there were hundreds of them. But I liked being away from everybody. And I soon realized that I was not alone there. And I made great friends with the pianist and great music mind, Jeffrey Swan. He was there. And then, of course, Emmanuel Axe was is still one of my greatest friends. And he was always there coming, and Garrick. And so it was quite a little group. And at first I was very overawed by them. But I think I can honestly say that I probably learned more from my colleagues, almost more than I did from my teacher. I mean, it wasn't just a question of trying to keep up with the boys, which was a big thing in those days. And, trying to play the repertoire that they played, sometimes with disastrous results, but that's okay. Once I felt integrated in that little group, then I was fine. And then I was brave enough. What I also would say was one of the great things that I learned was being in New York, taking advantage of the incredible cultural life, going every single night, either to the opera where we could get score desk seats for 250. I mean, that, come on, $2.50 to go to the opera, see some of the greatest singers of all time, and going to Carnegie Hall every other night or Lincoln Center. I mean, I really learned a lot. I learned a great deal, and so that was the wonderful part about the first three years or so in New York, until I realized that I'm not a city person. I'm a country person. And so, but that was later. That was later when I moved out.
I relate to that part of not really a big city person, but more of being,
Mhm.
I guess I'm more of a suburban kind of person.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in the
Hmm.
suburbs and I absolutely still love the suburbs.
Hmm.
So I think a lot of pianists or a lot of classical musicians, not all, of course, but many of them tend to be more introverted. Like
Yes.
what you've described there, I think is quite common because I myself am also an introvert.
Hmm.
So I'm very much someone who likes to keep to myself as well and to reflect on things mostly on my own, maybe with one or two other of my
Hmm.
close friends.
Hmm.
And at least my conversations with people tend to be a lot deeper than, oh, hey, how's the weather going? How's the food? How's that
Hmm.
kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
So I think though that as you mentioned, we're not alone, right? Because especially when there's so many of us who have a similar kind of temperament, I think
Yes.
classical music attracts a certain kind of temperament, a very peaceful, non-confrontational kind of a temperament, for the most part, of
Hmm.
course, that I think allows for this kind of deep introspection, deep reflection, deep consideration and thinking of things such as classical music and pianistic performance. I think that's important at the end of the day.
It's very important. And it's also very important to realize this very young. And I was, once you realize this, then if you do make a big career, you're prepared for it. Because going on the road, um, you're completely alone. And then some people will say, yeah, yeah, but you play with an orchestra and all those people. No, no, how can you make friends? I mean, after going back maybe 10 times to the same orchestra, you've made friends with people but you're there for 2, 3 days. And then of course recitals, which is for me the sort of 70% of what I do, there's nobody. You're by yourself. I'm lucky now that my husband travels with me, but you can't do that when you're young. It's a huge expense to have a second person. And well, as we all know, we're kind of the last legalized bastion of slavery, I would say, and that we're our fees go down, never up. So, we can't afford to have two people usually.
Yeah. Yeah. It's important to be comfortable with yourself and being alone with your own company when you want to pursue a
Yeah.
career like this.
Mhm.
I think even in life in general, especially when you're living in Canada or the US, where there's a huge emphasis on hyper individualism, just overall
Mhm.
as a cultural or a
Mhm.
social
Mhm.
thing. I think it's
Mhm.
important, even as a life skill nowadays, to be comfortable with your own company. Of course, ideally, you would want to be around at least a few other people. It doesn't necessarily have to be a lot of people, but there's not always will that be the case where you have again you have to be very much comfortable with being
Sure.
independent on a
Sure.
lot of ways.
Sure. Sure. And that you learn very, very early. I mean, I was already knew that it would be a so-called lonely life, although I never felt lonely by the age of 10 and 11. I went to normal school, but every possible minute I was home practicing. And for example, my mother saw to it that I didn't have to do games, that if the school went off on a nature hike, that I didn't go. I came home and practiced and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it was, you could call it lonely, but at the time I just thought it was normal.
Yeah, yeah, and same here. When I was still practicing piano and still performing in my early days, that's how I felt too. I thought it was normal for me to when it wasn't school, then I would be practicing and stuff. Like that was my normal, right? But in Canada, having grown up in Canada, I realized that a lot of kids didn't really actually went down that path. It's like, oh, they're actually around with their friends a lot more, or
Yeah.
going out to the mall a lot more, and doing all these social activities. I was like, Oh wow. Actually, that's actually fascinating. But I didn't feel like I missed out though. I didn't feel like I missed out at all. If I look back, I would do it again. I would do
Yeah,
the whole
I would
journey.
too. I would. Yeah.
Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, I would do things differently a little bit when it comes to the actual contents of the quality of the practice and also the performance as well. But the whole process, I wouldn't change a thing.
No, I look back and I see that there's certain things that were wrong. That I wouldn't, if I had a child, I maybe wouldn't do it that way. But at the time, I was having a fine time. It was perfectly okay with me. Nobody was abusing me or forcing me to do stuff I didn't want to do. I did it. That was it.
Yeah.
That's the way
Yeah.
it was.
And that's the best when you have the passion to do it and the drive, the long-term drive to do it. That's really a very strong factor in your favor when you're doing something that is very independent, like practicing piano or
Mhm.
performing.
Yeah.
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 So going back to that point in the 70s, the 1974 Arthur Rubinstein Master International Piano Competition would take place.
Right.
What inspires you to compete at that very first edition?
Okay. Well, there's a story to that, Amos. Um, I was about to go to law school. Yes.
Oh,
In fact,
okay.
I was accepted. I was accepted to the Université de Montréal. The first Arthur Rubinstein competition was actually supposed to be, I think it was like over 6 months earlier, but it was canceled because of a war. There was a Middle Eastern war going on. So that was just the final straw because I was 22 at the time. I was 23 when I actually went. I was 22 at the time, and I'd literally never played a professional concert except one in Sherbrooke, Quebec. That was it. I think I'd made $400 in my whole life. So the rest was school stuff. And I just figured you can't make a career in the 1970s as a woman, a real concert career in Canada, or for that matter, in the United States. So I said, oh, well, to hell with it. And then I have to make a living somehow. And I don't want to be living with my parents forever. So I'm going to law school. I mean, why law school? I mean, when I shake my head when I think about it. And then, of course, law school was to start in September, but then the Rubinstein competition was put on again. And I didn't choose it at all. It was Radio-Canada, the French CBC, who out of the blue got in touch with me and said they wanted me to represent Canada. And the second time it came round, I said, well, I should be going to law school, blah, blah. And my parents and Mr. Gorodnitzki all said, don't be ridiculous, go. And then I thought the main thing for me to go was to meet my hero, Arthur Rubinstein. I'd never met him, and I thought, I get to shake his hand. So uh, one day in September, I got on the plane in New York with my buddy Emmanuel Axe, and we flew over together. And the rest is history.
Wow. That
Yeah.
is really fascinating. Wow. I mean, it's literally a turning point in your life.
Oh, I mean, completely changed my life completely. If I hadn't met Rubinstein, God knows what I'd be doing right now. Well, I'd be retired, I guess. But still, no, actually, I wrote all this in my book. So it's all there
Yeah,
in
yeah.
detail.
Yeah, I should definitely pick up that book at some point very very soon because that is very very fascinating.
Yeah.
The Arthur Rubinstein competition itself.
Yeah.
How many rounds were there at the time? And take us through each round. How did you prepare for each of these?
Well, it was rather a big repertoire for those days. But of course, I just saw, for example, the amount of applicants for this Chopin competition was something like 400 and something or more, 500. I mean, in my day, well, I think that we were about 35 there. So probably there were about 60 applicants maximum. I mean, probably less. Um, the first round, this is a long time ago. The first round, I we had to play etudes, so I played fifth volet and I played the etude and thirds of Chopin because I thought, well, I can show off a little bit. And Scarbo, and then there was a piece composed for the competition by an Israeli composer whose name I have completely forgotten, but it was quite a nice piece. And I think I started, yes, Mozart Sonata in C minor. Oh God, Kirkel numbers, forget it. The one that has usually is played with the fantasy before it. But anyway, I played that. So it was Mozart, Israeli composition. There was a Debussy etude too, Arpège composé. So that's a hefty, and we were allowed to play everything. So we weren't stopped, and I was just there to shake Rubinstein's hand. So, and he wasn't there yet. He only turned up in the second round. So I was absolutely amazed when I made it to the second round. Amazed and very happy because now I really would get to shake his hand. The second round, there was Schoenberg, Opus 11, piece that I love. Opus 111, Beethoven, that I played, and the Liszt Sonata. As far as I remember, there was no Chopin. I didn't play any Chopin, although I remember others playing Chopin, but I did not. Anyway, Rubinstein was very impressed, lucky for me, with the Liszt Sonata. And so were some of the other jurors. And four of us made it to the finals, and I was one of the four. It was very exciting. In those days, of course, transparency was not something that was in competitions. The Rubinstein competition was lucky in that way that there was not a big Soviet presence. There were no Soviets on the jury because in those days those poor people were literally forced to vote for their own. I have, in retrospect, every sympathy for them because they weren't allowed out unless they were forced. It was nasty, but they weren't invited to the Rubinstein competition. What was in the Rubinstein competition were several jurors who had pupils, even ex-spouses, on the playing as participants. So there was rather a lot of hanky-panky going on, which Rubinstein was horrified at, and which I was a victim of because I was a Canadian, and Canadians at that time, who Canadian? Who? People just didn't know us. Kind of different now, but in those days, and so I made it through, but he pushed me through to the finals, which was also not kosher, as you would say. But anyway, thank you. He told me all this much later. One of the judges had given me a 0. So, and in those days, they didn't take off the lowest and the highest marks from the average. So it really basically killed me. But I made to the finals, and then I came third, and Emmanuel came first, and he was absolutely ready for the big career, and I was amazed at what was happening. And Rubinstein found me afterwards at one of the parties and said, "So where can I go and hear you? Well, what concerts are you playing?" And I sort of said, "Well, I've played one concert in my life, and that was in Sherbrooke, Quebec." And so he said, well, he was puzzled for a minute, and then he says, "Okay, well, I'll help you." And I thought, oh, well, isn't that nice? But I've shaken his hand, and that's nice. And that was enough to make me forget law school and keep plowing on. But then he came to New York in December, a few months later, and he got in touch with me, and by golly, he did help me. He became blind that year, and so he had to stop playing. Well, he was 88. But he did go on one last tour, and with every concert, he had a stipulation in his contract that I get the same concert the next year. So that was the beginning of my career. 44 concerts that Rubinstein had played the year before. I mean, hefty stuff for a youngster. But It's nice. And luckily, for the concertos, I mostly played Beethoven 4 and Chopin E minor, so there wasn't that much of a variety the first year. So I had a little bit of time to develop repertoire. And the recitals, of course, I had to play the Liszt Sonata because that's what everybody wanted. But then I added Chopin, of course, a lot of Chopin, and that was it. And to this day, my two favorite concertos to play are the Chopin E minor and the Beethoven 4. And the older I get and the more I now have to cut back on my repertoire, those are the two that are staying. So it's come full circle.
It truly has come full circle.
Yeah.
And I wanted to also explain to the audience about the significance of the piano sonata, Liszt piano sonata, and Chopin's concerto in E minor. Firstly, with the Liszt piano sonata, that is, well, first of all, for those of you who are tuning into any performance, of course, tune into Janina's performance, of course, but really with any pianist performance, you'll recognize just how long it is. It's basically about a half hour in one single sitting, no breaks, no intermissions. You go through the entire piece. So the length alone is already daunting on its own. On top of that, there are many running passages. It really challenges the maximum extent of many areas of a person's pianistic technique and performance, but also musicality at the same time. So really highly recommend any of you who are not familiar with that piece to take a look at that piece, because that is truly a fascinating area, a fascinating piece of music written by Franz Liszt, along with his vast array of repertoire. The second piece, Chopin's Piano Concerto in E minor, that's a classic, basically, especially you hear all the time at every Chopin competition. I think it's played way more often than his second piano concerto.
Yes.
So that one's also, actually, when I was competing at the Canadian music competition back in the old days, when I was still, still a teenager, that was actually my finals piece. And that would have been my finals piece if I had competed for the Canadian Chopin competition, which I trained for at one point, but then I gave up because school, right? So this piece is also, again, a classic, very musically rich and very touching as well. And for those of you who have seen the Canadian Chopin competition of 2025 just a few months ago as a time of recording, you'll see that in the finals that it's it moves you in a way that is so profound and stays with you for a very, very long time. So, but yeah, I mean, with your experience, these two pieces, are two very important pieces along with other pieces that have influenced how you focused on your career as well.
Very much so. Very much so. I just played the Chopin. I was on tour out west. I played it 3 times, and then I played it in Ontario again. And I first of all, I'm never tired of it, ever. Doesn't matter how, I've played it literally hundreds of times. Never tired of it, always finding something new and exciting in it. And those melodies are eternal, And the second movement brings me to tears every time I play it. It's not my playing, it's the music. And it's my goal, of course, to bring the audience along with me. And it is so touching when members of the audience come backstage and say, "Oh, I forgot everything that's going on in the world today, and I just was brought to tears." And so that's my goal, and that's exactly what my job is, to get people out of this horrible world into a much nicer one.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very, very well said. And also a bit of a pop culture reference for those of you in the audience. The second movement of Chopin's Piano Concerto in E minor, actually, that was a part of that actually was played in Jim Carrey's The Truman Show, actually, in the movie, at a specific scene. So for those of you who may not initially be familiar with it, you might be familiar if you watch that particular movie. But just a nice little bit of a pop culture reference there as well. Returning back to Arthur Rubinstein, though, he was willing to be your mentor. So what was it like to study with him?
Well, he was not a teacher. He didn't know how to develop someone's technique, how to develop somebody week by week by week. This was not that. This is what Gorodnitzki could do. But at the time I met Rubinstein, I didn't need that. I needed more of a coach. And that's exactly what he was. And he used to say, "Oh, no, no, I'm not a teacher. I give some helpful advices to younger colleagues." Yeah, right. But this is what advice is. But basically, he would sit down and play. And then I would listen and I would try to learn how he would do things. And of course, it was almost impossible for me because he was a genius and I wasn't. But I learned a lot, and I learned a lot about structure, how important structure is. Take a piece like the Liszt Sonata. If you don't start the piece knowing exactly where it's going the whole way of the 28 minutes I play it in, the piece dies somewhere and everybody gets bored. But any piece, like a Chopin ballade, you have to have structure, planning. Then the beautiful sound. Now, his sound, yes, he used a Gorodnitzki sound, but he used many, many other sounds. And what he had, which more than anybody else I know, he knew how to communicate fantastically to the audience, which meant that he knew how to project emotion with sound. And I used to play, and he pointed it out and made me very aware, although he could not show me how to do it. But he made me very aware that I was playing for myself on stage, and that if I would play a very, very soft sound, it sounded great to me, but it would not sound like anything to the person at the back of the 3,000 seat hall. In fact, it would sound dead. And so he said he couldn't teach me how to project the sound, but I learned from experience and I knew that I had to do it. And then, of course, the Arthur Rubinstein rhythm. He had not metronomic, tick, 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 but the pulse of the piece. He somehow always knew whether it was Spanish music, Russian music, or Chopin. And what he liked about my Chopin was that I just somehow genetically, or I don't know what, understood the rhythms of the mazurkas and the polonaises sort of automatically. But there were other pieces. There was some Schumann, for example, that we had a huge drama over because he just thought I didn't understand the pulse of the piece. And so we worked it and worked it. I finally got it. It was the second movement of the Schumann Fantasy. But, this was terribly important to him. So rhythm, structure, sound, those were the things that I mainly learned from Arthur Rubinstein, apart from having fun in life. And he used to try and stop me from practicing because he never practiced. I mean, he truly never practiced. He would run through a piece before the concert and that was it. And if he made a mistake in the run through, he'd make sure that he'd think about it in the concert and correct it in the concert. He was a genius, and I had to practice. So eventually he realized that it made me happy to practice. But we were poles apart in everything, basically. He was the bon vivant who went out and had partied all night, and I had to go to bed at 10 o'clock, and things. But that's why we loved each other. So it was great. He was the older man and I was the youngster that he was trying to help. And he had come to a point in his life where he really wanted someone to help because he'd gone blind and he couldn't play himself anymore. So it was wonderful.
That is truly, truly amazing and truly a very, very heartwarming dynamic between yourself and Rubinstein that I don't think a lot of people would know about, because there's this kind of perception of the great pianist as this pedestal, almost like a Socratic / Platonic / Aristotelian kind of caliber, right? But people forget that they are human just like all of us. They have their quirks, they have their lifestyle, they have their hobbies, they have personalities that, I mean, here in North America, some would say you would be able to have a beer with. In Asia, you'd be able to sit over tea with at some point, right? So I think it's so heartwarming to hear that. It's an important reminder for the audience.
I have to say that he was special, though, amongst them in his character. I mean, he just loved people, and there were at the time we dealt with people like Claudia Rao and Rudolf Serkin and Benedetti Michelangeli and Horowitz, and they were all very different characters. And they didn't love life like Arthur did. Arthur just had fun all the time. And people like Horowitz suffered, you know. They had anxieties. Michelangelo just didn't want to deal with people. It was very difficult to his students. Sirkin was an interesting autocrat and very, very kind to me. I met him. And Arau was very nervous. Lovely, but very nervous. And, so everyone was different. But in the end, when I met them, they were all perfectly nice to me.
Wow. Nice. That is so, so cool.
Mm-hmm.
And with all these different personalities and with all these different musicians, all of them have their own sense of musicality as well. And so do you as well. As we head into a deeper discussion of the road to Warsaw, musicality, and Chopin, this is a question that I ask every single musician. What is musicality to you?
It's an overwhelming emotion. I think nowadays there are more fantastic young pianists than ever before. That's a fact. And most of them are extremely musical, which means to say that they make it their life's mission to make what they're playing something very beautiful that will appeal to an audience. Now, how can you get a winner if they're all so fantastic and all playing musically? Well, the winner, if one is lucky, is someone with an exceptional something or other that cannot be explained. That is a gift from God, if you believe in God. It is somehow that little breath they take in the middle of a phrase, that little hesitation, that sudden accent that only maybe they don't even realize they're doing. But that's musicality. That's instinct. That's what the exceptional ones do. And the fact that we have nowadays fantastic kids playing, but there's still only a handful of exceptionals. And that's the way it's always been. And, I'm happy to go to concerts. I'm happy to hear the kids. But when I hear, you should see us on juries, for example. Okay, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here because I was very rude about the juries back in the 1970s, although there were nice people on them, but still, it was all very strange. But nowadays, I've been on many juries. I have never seen anything illegal done. It is usually all the marks are published, so you can't have hidden marks. For the very top marks and the very bottom marks, they're always eliminated so that you get a good average mark at the end of each person. And you're never allowed to have a pupil in the jury. I mean, pupils going back 5, 10 years, you're not allowed to judge them, and things like that. I mean, okay, so it's as honest as it can be, and there are always things that people don't like in competitions, but of course there are, because we all have different taste. I mean, I've sat beside jurors that I simply can't understand why they're voting the way they're voting, and yet they're some of the best musicians I've ever met. We're all different. We all have these different. So competitions are tricky, but there is always one, not always, but sometimes one candidate that somehow rises above everybody else. And we can be sitting there, 7, 9, 12 jurors, in a fog because we're so tired. We've listened to, I don't know, sometimes I remember listening to 26 Mazeppas of Liszt and just nearly dying because I just never wanted to hear that piece again. But, you have this responsibility that these kids, it's their whole life that we have in our hands, trying to keep awake and trying to listen. And then suddenly somebody comes on, just could be a young girl from, I don't know, from Japan or from Paris or somewhere, just walks on, and from the first note, it's something completely different. And everybody, the entire jury wakes up, our eyes are open, and we're overwhelmed by this talent, and this person will win. but that's not always the case. Most of the time, we get, as I say, fantastic people, and then we have to fight it out who's going to win because there's no clear winner.
Yeah. And with your experience being the chair of the Junior Van Cliburn in 2023,
Yeah.
I think that's
Mhm.
also a great example of that.
Mhm.
And even looking at 2022's Van Cliburn, I mean,
Mhm.
Yunchan Lim is someone
Mhm.
that comes to mind when it comes to that very characteristic, that ability to
Absolutely.
stand out from just a very stark
That's it.
competition. And
Hmm.
Bruce Liu, the winner of the 2021
Yeah.
International Chopin Competition, also a great example as well. So
Bruce Bruce has something that is rare in a young person. Bruce has huge charisma. He plays brilliantly and musically and interestingly, but he has star quality, and that's something else that you can't work on. He just has it. He walks on stage and everybody's alive and listening. And no, he's a wonderful kid, and he also has absolutely the right attitude. He chills. I mean, he's cool. And I think if he hadn't won the Chopin competition, he would be perfectly all right. He'd just do something else. Um, in fact, when he was in Warsaw, I heard this story that Bruce uh, loves to do go-karts
yes,
and drive go-karts. And in Warsaw, they arranged a competition between him and the Polish go-kart champion. Guess who won? Bruce. No,
yeah,
he's just a winner.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in an alternate universe, if he didn't go down piano, he may have had a dream and going into F1 and Formula One at some point. I don't know. Maybe that would have been
Oh yeah.
the
Yeah,
yeah.
he would, but no, he's, and I've known him since he was a young boy, and sure he's determined, sure he's ambitious, but he has that other side of him, that wonderful Canadian side. He's not a killer. He's a real human being, and I'm so glad that he's doing so well. Oh,
Yeah.
but listen, talk about Canadians. We have him, Charles Richard Hamelin. What a talent that is. Now that for me, that's an old-fashioned. He's like a throwback to the golden years with his sound and his phrasing and no, so there's another one. Then Kevin Chen, who could play anything that's put in front of him. He's a brilliant boy. Jaden from the West. I never can pronounce his last name. Durzo, I think. And Jan Leszecki. I mean, Canada's number one, really, if it comes to the young people.
Yeah.
So if a Canadian comes in the competition, and I think there are quite a few this year in Warsaw, the jury better pay attention.
Yeah. And at the time of this recording, we have 5 Canadians who are in the preliminaries, 4 of
Mhm.
which were a laureates of an edition of the Canadian Chopin competition, 3 of whom were laureates of this year's Canadian Chopin competition. So, and I've had the pleasure of being one of the organizers and hosts of the Canadian Chopin competition. Also, was one of the 2 MCs of the competition as well.
Mhm.
So I saw firsthand just how good Canadian pianists really are. And I think in Canada in particular, we really need to pay more attention to these because if you were to look at the Canadian educational system as a whole, you wouldn't be able
Mhm.
to tell that a lot of people would have this kind of trajectory towards music education. I mean,
Yeah.
solfege, good luck even asking that from the average Canadian because most Canadians
Mhm.
don't know about that unless
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
get music lessons outside of school. But
Yeah.
when you look at again these pianists, like I don't, like, I mean, I almost want to say out of nowhere, but not really out of nowhere. But since 2015, I mean, with Charles Richard Hamelin getting second in the International Chopin competition, and then Bruce
Yeah.
Liu winning first, and then Eric Guo
First.
winning first at the period instrument
Exactly.
International Chopin
Yes.
competition.
Yes, I meant to mention Eric. Yes.
Yeah, and it's just wow. It's out of all of a sudden, now Canada is on the world map with a massive bang.
Yeah, it is. You know, in Quebec, it's understandable. In the province of Quebec, there is since year one there has been a tradition of piano, and that was mainly because of the nuns, the Catholic Church. They all taught piano, and a lot of them taught very well. The École Vincent d'Indy was run by nuns, basically. That's why André Laplan, Marc-André Amna, and Louis Lortie, we all studied there. So Quebec is not so surprising because now all the pupils and all the third generation is still going on. What is much more interesting is the West Coast, and then more recently Alberta, and I think that, of course, is a huge influence of may I compliment you here, the very hardworking Asians, and they're very, I'm going to put this tactfully, their parents who were not afraid to make them work. And that's perhaps something that is now missing in the general, I would say, U.S. Piano community, that parents feel that it's not right to make your child practice 4 hours a day. But I'm sorry, or 5 hours. You just have to if you're going to make a career. That's just a prerequisite. And the talent coming out of the West now, it's just amazing. And so Canada is number one. I'm sorry, but there's no other country that's producing and such different kinds of pianists. The variety is huge. There are a lot of pianists coming out of the Ukraine, wonderful girl pianists coming out of Georgia, former Soviet Georgia. But they all tend to be from the same kind of background of playing. Whereas, take or my generation, the difference between me, Angela Hewitt, and Marc-André Hamelin, we couldn't be more different, really, the way we play. And if you put on a recording of one of us, we would never be confused one with the other. And that's the same with this younger generation as well, I think. So that's great.
Yeah. And first of all, thank you so much for the kind words towards the Asian community. This is something that I also mentioned in previous episodes. For being of ethnic Chinese descent myself, I was born and raised in Canada, but I'm of ethnic Chinese descent. Piano is to us as hockey is to the average Canadian. Yeah. So when it comes to practice, when it comes to learning piano, when it comes to learning classical music in general, for us, we also have the additional part where it's non-negotiable. This is what we must learn. Yeah. We absolutely must learn. Even if we're not going down a path of performance, even if we're not going down a music career of any kind, this is something that we must have in our skills toolbox. So the number of hours practicing, the number of hours going to lessons, the number of hours going to performances or being a part of these performances, we would put in as much money as we need, because this isn't really much an issue of money for us. This is a very, very meaningful expense for most ethnic Chinese Canadian families, and really Chinese American families too, but really even in Asia, in the mainland, and also in other areas as well. Very, very much expected out of all of us.
Of course. And of course the fact that scientists have proved that working at the piano develops your mind. In your brain. And I think that's something that Asian parents have realized very early on. And I just wish that more Caucasians had thought of it. But, I'm saying that. But, of course, I have quite a few kids coming, for example, from the Ukraine to play for me. And it's an absolute staple there. Kids play the piano. It's one of the things.
Yeah. And that part about practice as well, Jane was mentioning this to me even on a previous episode, where even during the Junior Van Cliburn, there was an allotted time of 9 hours a day, or 6 or 9 hours a day I don't know, I think it was 6. I forgot the exact number, but there was a certain number of hours that were allotted to practice for each pianist, and apparently they were complaining because it was not enough time.
Yeah, that's for me, that's too much. That's really too much. Yes, I practiced 5 or 6 hours a day. I couldn't manage more than six. But after 3 hours, you're just practicing by rote. You're not capable of being creative after 3 concentrated hours. And I can have Fryderyk Chopin back me up on that one because he said that. He said after 3 hours, it's useless. But if you want to, at that age, at the young age in your early 20s or teens, you're learning a lot of repertoire. So the 6 hours makes sense because you can use three of those hours to learn things by heart and just develop your technique. But as
Yeah.
far as musicality, it's good, and putting the music and the interpretation, 3 hours is fine.
Yeah.
And now in my old age, 2 hours is my limit, but it's
Yeah.
very, very concentrated.
Yeah. 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 I think a lot of the younger pianists, when they focus so much on that kind of practicing all that, I think it's also because we almost treat it like a sport, at least for in the Asian communities, we almost treat it like a sport at that level where you're kind of developing your own endurance at that. So I kind of see where they're coming from when it comes to being in all these competitions and then being on so many different rounds. It's like, I mean, it's like I have the musicality down, but it's like, do I have the endurance down? And if the answer is
Yeah,
no,
or can I play?
yeah,
Or can I play it as fast and as loud as the next person without missing a note?
yeah,
That's but that is a real sign of the times. Yes, sure, we were sort of like that in my youth, but the poor kids nowadays with this live streaming, and that they can be playing in their aunt's sitting room for a few people, and someone will record it, and the next day it'll be all over the internet. So they have to be perfect at a very, very young age. And when I mean perfect, I mean hitting all the right notes at a very fast speed. And so that is slightly different, but in the end, it all works out the same. I'm really, really curious to see how this generation of very fine young pianists will be playing in 15, 20 years. This will be interesting
yeah,
for me.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And returning to Chopin,
Yeah.
you also have a unique cultural connection, being also partially Polish as well.
Yeah. Hmm.
Who is Fryderyk Chopin to you, both musically and culturally?
Musically speaking, I think he was the greatest composer for the keyboard ever, for the modern, because the piano he composed on at the end was I played both Chopin concertos on it, and it's really almost like the modern instruments. So he just had an understanding of the modern keyboard that was unparalleled, except maybe Liszt. And then later on, well, Ravel too was extraordinary. Understood all the colors and the textures and everything you get. So, and also that he was the melody meister of all time. I mean, the Chopin melodies they go straight to my heart. Maybe is it because my father was Polish? I don't know, but he's always touched me incredibly. The other thing about Chopin that is he is a historical figure, and you realize that Poland, for a century, was not a country at all. It didn't exist. It was divided up between Prussia, Austria, and Germany, or yeah, Prussia, Russia, and Germany. That's it. And well, what kept these people Polish all those years? Well, there was Chopin, his music. There was also the Catholic Church that kept people going, but it held them together, and that's why in Poland he is revered like a saint. Really, I mean, I've never seen anything like the Chopin competition in Warsaw, and my father told me that when he was a boy, and we're talking in the 30s, that the whole country stopped and everybody was glued to the radio to listen to the Chopin competition. So it's like it's a cult thing. It's just it's amazing, and that well, so Chopin has always meant a lot to me. And he, funnily enough, he's technically to play Chopin is hard. You know that, and I know that. But he's a composer I feel by far the most comfortable in, technically. And when I get to the Chopin on the program, I can breathe a huge sigh of relief because I know it's just somehow going to go fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And with the International Chopin Competition having its current status as essentially the Olympics of piano,
Yeah.
it's truly deserving and truly a wonderful result of all those years of tribulation and trials that now turns into basically one of the crowning achievements of Poland itself. And
Yes.
I would say, I mean, I say this very carefully, probably one of the most important cultural exports to the world in terms of that. I think even the Polonaise, I mean, Polonaise existed long before Chopin existed, of course, but
Yeah.
the Polonaise was recognized as a cultural heritage entity. I'm not sure if I'm using the right wording for it, but it's was recognized for its cultural heritage by UNESCO.
Hmm.
So even looking at that, and really even how Chopin was able to contribute to the development of the Polonaise and to cement it within modern Polish culture to this very day,
Yep.
that I think is just so profound.
Yep. You're right. You're right. Yeah, but it also, I mean, all the other Polish rhythms that he put in all this, there's always, even in the ballades, you'll find some kind of Polish rhythm somewhere or other, or a nocturne. But yes, absolutely. And the Polonaise is the A flat Polonaise. One hears it and one wants to get up and go and save the fatherland and all this. So that, yeah, it has a wonderful effect on everyone.
Yeah, yeah. And knowing both the Chopin competition and the Van Cliburn competition, from your standpoint, aside from the cultural impact that it has, how else, and I should say, why else are these two competitions so revered amongst even just the general public, and at least in your experience from what you found?
I think, well, with the Chopin competition, it's clear this is something that's been going on for years. It's one of the oldest competitions. It's built up a reputation. If you look at the past winners, some of the greatest names in music have won. I mean, Martha Argerich, Garrick, Polini, then that's far back. I mean, there are a lot of Bruce now, you know, and then Richard and people like that. It's just the list goes on. There's some of the greatest pianists of all time have won it, and so that is cemented its reputation, and that's why everybody wants to go to it. That's why there's so many applicants because they know that if you win the first prize, your career is there. I mean, forever. You've got it. And there, frankly, no other competitions that can do that nowadays, particularly since the Tchaikovsky in Moscow's not, happening anymore for the time being. With the Van Cliburn, it's a new kid on the block, basically, although it's now getting quite old. For the first Van Cliburn, so, yeah, it's quite a while ago. Must be 50 years. Um, it's just very, very well organized. And what's good about the Van Cliburn, of course, is a lot of money involved, but they look after their contestants unbelievably well. And it's not just the first prize winner that gets a series of concerts, but first, second, third prize are all looked after magnificently well. And so it's a good competition. I mean, it's worth going to. May I just add that on the very similar to the Van Cliburn is the Honens in Calgary. Very similar. They look after their own. There are good competitions. Some that I love being on the jury is Geneva, because normally you go to Geneva and you can't afford Geneva. It's one of the most expensive cities. But if you're on the jury, of course, everything's paid for, and I just love going there. And everyone's so polite and everybody's so nice. So no, there are lots of accommodations. Utrecht Liszt is a pleasure to go to. So, but you're right. The biggest one is the Chopin. Then there's the five band Cliburn, and I would still put up the venerable Queen Elizabeth in Brussels and Leeds.
Yeah. Yeah. These are essentially the grand slams, essentially, for
Yes,
anybody who's a tennis fan
yes,
out there, the grand slams of piano competitions
yes,
out there.
yes,
And
yes.
it's truly, yeah. And I, of course, would encourage our audience to really tune into this one, especially right now with the Chopin prelims and eventually the main competition in October with the International Chopin Competition. It's all live streamed on YouTube on
Yeah,
the Chopin Institute's YouTube channel. So
yeah,
totally free to watch and or listen to. So
yeah.
be very, very sure to tune into those as well. In your own practice, in your own performance, and this is going to be a very multi-layered question. When you look at pieces of music, and of course it would be somewhat different for different composers, how do you express like bel canto? How do you sing the melody, harmony, counter melodies, and counterpoint in a way that makes sense? And how do you approach that in a solo performance versus an ensemble performance versus a performance with an orchestra? Like, how does that how does that strategy work in your head?
Uh, Take a piece of Chopin. If I ever have any problem with Chopin figuring out how a phrase should go, I sing it. It's all vocal. With Chopin, it's all bel canto. So if I have a singing tone, if I know what a phrase, if I have it sung in my head, then for me, there's absolutely no problem. Whether other people like what I'm doing, that's something else. But for me, it works out. That's why I am not so good, for example, in more percussive music, um, because my whole strength lies in that probably those basic Gorodnitzki sound, but also the sound that I developed through knowing Rubinstein, and then my natural phrasing and my basic understanding of Chopin. But I always tell my students if they do if they're playing Chopin, they're absolutely confused about what to do. I said, just sing it. Imagine that you're a great singer and just and nobody's going to listen to you if you have a horrible voice, but sing it, and then it's obvious how to play it. And Chopin, of all composers, was completely in love with Bellini and Donizetti and bel canto, and this is what he was imitating, especially in the earlier, the concertos, for example. So that's very easy. Second part of your question, I can't remember.
Yeah, it was essentially how does that strategy
Oh,
change or stay the same with different with either solo
yeah,
performance, ensemble, or orchestra?
right. Well, with ensemble, of course, it's a lot of, well, how it changes. It changes with a hell of a lot of rehearsal. If you have a chamber ensemble, you've got to have tons of rehearsal. I hated the chances sometimes in summer festivals when people just come for a day and throw the music together. This is not me. I like days of rehearsal. And something wonderful will come out of that because you listen to the other person and sometimes you imitate the violin or the cello, or sometimes they imitate you and stuff like that. With orchestra, of course, it's quite different. With orchestra, it's a question of the conductor, first of all. Do you or do you not get along with the conductor? Nowadays, if you have more than two rehearsals, that's really unusual. So you have to get everything ready in basically 2 hours. So if you happen to be lucky and get some fabulous conductor, then it's a joy. It's an absolute joy because then you're in sync with 80 players and this wonderful conductor, and they allow you to shine. That's the good performance. It isn't always like that. So a lot of the time, playing with the orchestra is a question of compromise. You know, I sometimes just simply can't take the time at the ends of phrases or something, because I know that they won't know what I'm doing, and so I have to make it a little bit shorter. Yeah, that all comes with experience. All comes with experience. I know exactly after about 10 minutes what kind of orchestra it is, and also what kind of conductor it is. And hopefully, at least the conductor is a very pleasant person so that we can get along and work together.
Yeah, yeah, and that's so well said. And it's great that you mentioned this, even nowadays, especially nowadays, I should say, with just such a very truncated amount of time where you only have really one rehearsal and only a couple hours to figure everything out in that time.
Yes.
I think that's also a new reality that a lot of young pianists have to face that may not have been as common back in the old days. But I think they've gotten so well at adapting to that because of their youth that this is, I mean, it would have been originally a hurdle, but then eventually would have become more just like, oh, just a nice little hill to kind of get across and be able to adapt very quickly on the fly as well. And I think that's also important even as a pianist when you're performing, even outside of a competition.
I think this is also why in competitions, so often when you get to the finals and you've had someone play brilliantly in the first few rounds, the finals are usually with orchestra and they crash and burn because they don't know how to play with orchestra. Because where do you get an orchestra? Unless you are going to one of the big schools and you have a chance you try out with. But I've seen that happen often. And that's when I try and get in touch with a very talented person that I've seen eliminated because they can't play with orchestra. And that's where people like myself who are on jury should then step in and try and help these young talented types. Somebody has to help,
Yeah.
and who better than an older colleague?
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that's also an interesting, it's not really a hurdle, it's more just a bit of a debate, and this is unique towards the International Chopin Competition, or really Chopin's music as well. It's the Polish National Edition versus the Paderewski Edition.
Oh,
Yeah, so that it's really fascinating because for those who are not too familiar with the Polish National Edition, it's still an ongoing project of developing an urtext for Chopin's music. But I mean, the main question is it even possible to do that given just
no,
how much history? Yeah,
no,
exactly.
it's not. Look, Chopin also taught. That's how he made his living. And he taught his own compositions and some very talented, mainly women. And he would change things in their scores. And, one has to take that into account. That he didn't play many concerts, but he played in salons most nights. And of course, he was changing things all the time. So the thing is, someone like Cortot, who not many people outside of France use his editions. But Cortot studied with a pupil of Chopin. Cortot knew pupils of Chopin. Cortot was a great Chopin pianist. So if he writes something that maybe is questionable, in his edition, yeah, but maybe he has some kind of knowledge that others didn't have. So I basically, when I had to record Chopin, I would just take a mixture. I learned my Chopin, first of all, on the Cortot editions, but then I used the Paderewski, then I used Henley because they might be pedantic, but they really try. And I've given up with the latest Polish edition. It's just too much. So that's what I do. I take into account that things were changed all along in Chopin's time, and I just try and use my common sense.
Yeah, yeah,
If if there's some youngsters listening to this, you're entering the Chopin competition, use the Polish edition because that's the one they're going to use. But otherwise, do like me and check out all the editions.
Yeah, yeah, and those are good words to note and good advice for younger pianists who
Mhm.
are entering either this edition or future
Yeah.
editions of the competition.
Hmm.
Really,
Hmm.
very much is important to remember
Hmm.
for that. Now, of course, in your career, there have been so many misconceptions that you have personally seen about piano and classical music as a whole. What are the most common ones that you've seen?
Oh, okay. What irritates me more than anything else are television shows where there's a party and they're playing classical music, and then someone says, "Oh, let's hear something else," and then they put on popular music. Popular, that's with the, and that's suddenly everybody's having fun. That really annoys me, you know. So that's what that classical music is something elitist and boring, and that is compared to everything else is just not worth listening to. It's
Yeah,
reserved for only a very few people.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe. I
It's still
don't
an
think so.
issue.
Not in Canada. Not in Canada.
Yeah. And Canada's a very interesting case because, as we mentioned earlier in this conversation, Canada is really on the map with
Yeah.
classical pianists,
Yeah.
with especially with the Chopin competition, but just overall, this new
Overall.
generation, the current generation, is just really going out there
Yeah.
and making
Yeah.
their names known, and Canada is now known. But again, when you go to the average Canadian, though, many of
Hmm.
them don't even know who they are. And
Yeah.
with their education, again, many of them
Mhm.
aren't even taught solfege in school. If anything, at least here in Ontario,
Yeah.
there have been so many cuts to music education that now teachers who have no musical training of any kind are
Mhm.
teaching music off of carts from a book. And that's it. And that's the extent of music education now. And that's been a thing in not every school, but some schools in Ontario since 2016. So not even
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
years.
Yeah.
So
I've heard about that.
yeah,
No,
it's
and you see, this is what this is doing is killing the audience of the future. Because how do we get audiences? Well, by teaching kids either to play in a band or sing in a choir or do basic piano or just basic stuff. We're going to lose everybody except for the fanatics, like you and I, when they're in their 20s, because they have university, they're getting degrees, they're getting mortgages, they're getting families, but then they the kids grow up, and at 40, suddenly they think, oh, yeah, there's music. And they start going to concerts again. They start playing the piano, taking lessons. I have friends here in Germany who are studying instruments now, and they're my age because they didn't have a chance to do it before. Um, you're absolutely right. You have to get it. Have to get music for the young kids. Otherwise, it's all over. We have some of the greatest young pianists in the world. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, but if there's no audience, what are these people going to do in 10 years? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Even with the Canadian Chopin competition, and this is at least from my own personal experience. I'm lucky in the sense that when I went to university, and at that point I was not focusing on piano anymore as much. I was more focusing on getting through university, going to law school, becoming a lawyer. But
Mhm.
one of the hobbies that I did, one of the career things that I did during my university years, and something that I still do now as a hobby, is sports announcing. Because
Mhm.
in Canada and the US, sports are essentially the cultural thing. Again, like I mentioned, to us, ethnic Chinese people are to piano as the Canadians are to hockey, for example.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was able to take some of that. I found that it works by taking some of that experience in that world. And then for the Chopin competition, explaining to them. That's why I use terminology like the Olympics of piano or the Olympic qualifiers of piano for the Canadian Chopin competition.
Mhm.
Because for the average Canadian who may not have that similar level of knowledge in the musical world, they're like, oh, I get it now. Like, this is that important. And when I tell them how much, there's actually a lot in common with how much you practice when you lift weights, when you do your cardio, when you do all these different workouts and exercises in sports. Well, you also do the same thing when you're practicing your trills, your scales, your arpeggios, all these different running passages, also octaves, chromaticism, all these different techniques. Then you go into a performance. But the performance for us, we have one additional part off of not just the technique, it's the musicality. And that's something that athletes don't really have because it's really just the athleticism. When I explain it to them in that way, then I realize I see their reactions. They tend to be like, oh, now I get it. And when they come to the Canadian Chopin competition, many of them were like, wow, I had no idea that you could play piano to that level. And not only that, every single pianist in the Canadian Chopin competition is at that same level and is just, wow. I find that being able to relate to them in sort of different ways, and I don't want to say not unconventional ways, but, and also non-musical examples, I think, at least in my experience, sort of works in trying to bridging the gap between the lack of musical knowledge here in Canada.
Oh, definitely. That's also why for years now, when I play, even in the bigger towns in Canada and certainly the United States, talking to the audience. Not incredibly complicated stuff, but just explaining one little thing to listen for, or one little thing. Terribly important. You know, it's audiences love that. If you keep it short and if you keep it amusing. But, you know, to tell them, well, there's this theme that's going through the whole piece, and it's a theme, you know, this, that, the other, and you explain about it just 3 minutes. And it'll improve their understanding of what you're doing, and, well, they'll just enjoy it more. And that's important.
Totally agree. Totally agree. As we start to close this episode of the podcast, just a couple of questions. One of the most rewarding things about your career that you've learned over the many decades that you've performed, one of the most important lessons that you've learned in your career, and what is your advice to those who want to pursue a career in classical music, especially piano?
Okay. The most rewarding things have been those moments, and believe me, it's not the whole concert. Sometimes it isn't at all in the concert. You can play well, but there are sometimes moments where you feel like you're touching the soul of the composer, literally, that you're one with the composer. You can almost smell the atmosphere of Paris in the 1830s, that you feel the cold, that you feel the food, everything, and you're playing this music and you feel the anguish. That is incredibly rewarding. Also, the audience, if I feel that they're with me, oh, is that nice? And then people coming backstage and yes, I'm always terribly tired after a concert, and maybe I shouldn't sit backstage and talk to everybody, but I love getting feedback. So that's very important to me, all of that. My advice to youngsters, though, please don't go into music thinking that you're going to make a fortune. You're not. If you start thinking you're going to make a lot of money being a concert pianist, no way. It happens to maybe 3 or 4 people. And so your reasons for being a pianist, a concert pianist, are to bring joy into the lives of your audience and to respect the composers that you're playing and honor them. Those are basically honor the composer and bring joy to the audience. Those are the 2 reasons. There are no other reasons.
Great words to end on. Janina, it's been a pleasure to have you on the show and for you to share your experiences and your career on what you've gone through and what you've learned from such an amazing adventure across the world. I think our audience is very much going to learn a lot from our conversation today. And again, thank you so much for sharing the living legend of Janina Fialkowska.
Thank you.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in to this episode of This is Legend of. You have just watched or heard the living legend of Janina Fialkowska. You can follow her concert series on her website, www.fialkowska.com. There you'll find out all about her, as well as her next several performances throughout the entire year. You can follow her on that. Also, be sure to support her through her discography as well as her book as well. And you can also support us here on This is the Legend of. For those of you watching on YouTube, remember to sforzando the like button, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and click on the bell notification icon so you'll always be notified whenever we upload. And for those of you listening to the audio-only versions, be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcast on the regular basis. Thank you so much for tuning in to This is Legend of, and also the mini-series of The Road to Warsaw. Be sure to stay tuned for more. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay legendary.